All right, fellas. So, going to talk a little bit today about 10.2, and basically 10.2, as you can see here in the objectives, is talking about a rising tide of protest and violence. All right. So, basically, in the 1850s, after the Compromise of 1850, we're going to look at some instances where tensions mount to the point where we're experiencing some violence in response to the issue of slavery in the United States. So, first thing we're going to look at, excuse me, is the how the Fugitive Slave Act increased tensions between the North and South. We'll take a long look at the Kansas-Nebraska Act and how that was seen differently by the North and the South, and then we'll explain why fighting broke out in Kansas and the effects of that conflict. Issue with the yellow slide pretty early here, all right, and to kind of talk about why any of this matters. So, basically, the Compromise of 1850 was meant to calm the debate over slavery in the U.S., but again, several provisions, several parts of that compromise continue to contribute to outbreaks of violence over slavery throughout the 1850s. The Fugitive Slave Act, violence in Kansas, and we're going to also talk about the Sumner Brooks incident in Congress, show the deep divide between the North and South on the issue of slavery, and really kind of gives us a feel for the passion that either side has when it comes to defending the issue of slavery. So the first thing we're going to look at is the Fugitive Slave Act. So you guys remember that was one of the provisions of the Compromise of 1850. And basically, to get the Compromise of 1850 through, the North basically agreed to a stricter Fugitive Slave Act. All right, the Fugitive Slave Act was an act that compelled Northerners to return escaped slaves to the North to the South. All right, this is certainly something, as you look at that first bullet point, that is unpopular amongst Northerners. All right, and in response, several states passed what are called personal liberty laws. Personal liberty laws were laws that allowed for the arrest of actually those who were hunting slaves in the North. All right, so those bounty hunters, those slave owners who were coming north to try to recover what was be considered their property. The personal liberty laws allowed for the arrest of these folks who were hunting slaves in the North. All right, the personal liberty laws essentially are illegal. All right, and again, we talked about this idea of nullification when we talked about the Tariff of Abominations back during Andrew Jackson's administration, and this would be something similar to that, where again, you have a federal law, the Fugitive Slave Act, but the states are nullifying or refusing to enforce parts of that Fugitive Slave Act. Also, too, as part of the Fugitive Slave Law, the Fugitive Slave Act, many times free African Americans are kidnapped and sold back into slavery. Again, we see that in reaction to the Fugitive Slave Act, we see kind of this reaction bubble over into violence a couple of times here, and we're going to talk about the Christiana Riot. The Christiana Riot is basically an event that occurred in 1851 where a southern slave owner is killed during a scuffle where he had come north, and again, Edward Gorsuch was his name, and Edward Gorsuch was a Marylander. He had come into Pennsylvania to try to recover several of his escaped slaves. Basically, what happened was word got out that Gorsuch was coming to basically take his slave back to Maryland. All right. Again, you had a community of free African Americans that came out to defend this slave. And again, like I said, in that ensuing scuffle, Gorsuch ends up dead. 30 people are actually tried in the conspiracy here, meaning that they were kind of charged as being a part of this event. However, none of them are found guilty, and this basically shows the kind of the displeasure that the Northerners had with the Fugitive Slave Act. All right, so where they decided that again they weren't going to prosecute the people that were involved in Gorsuch's death, generally because they disagreed with the fact that he was even coming north to recover his slave. No one has actually tried for the murder of Edward Gorsuch. And again, like we said, this in the last bullet point there, the Christiana Riot illustrates the reluctance and refusal of many Northerners to participate in the capture and return of slaves to the South. The Underground Railroad, and again, this is something we actually touched upon in our African American History Month PowerPoints, and one of the guys, and one of the groups did Harry Tubman, but again, also too, there was, again, efforts to help slaves escape from the South into the North. All right, the Underground Railroad was this system. All right, and again, where abolitionists and free African Americans basically used established routes to help slaves escape the South. Again, it's not a literal railroad. All right, there is no train that slaves are hopping on to escape to the North. All right, but it's basically kind of a route that used words associated with railroads, where again you had a number of safe houses, kind of like a station, and conductors were those who helped facilitate this travel to the North. Harriet Tubman is the most well-known of these conductors of the Underground Railroad, and again, really the most famous. She helps hundreds of slaves escape to the South, and she actually takes close to 2 dozen trips back into the South to help slaves escape into the North. Also, Harriet Tubman is a native of Cambridge, Maryland. All right, and again was enslaved on the Eastern Shore, and again returned over and over again to the Eastern Shore to help slaves escape into the North. Also, too, important to mention some influential literature of the 1850s as well. Two novels in particular that had influence over the opinions of Northerners when it came to slavery. The most famous is Uncle Tom's Cabin. All right, Uncle Tom's Cabin is written in 1852 by Harriet Beecher Stowe, and is really the most well-known of anti-slave literature during the period. Uncle Tom's Cabin sold 300,000 copies in the first year of its release, and really what Uncle Tom's Cabin did is it gave a human face to slavery. All right, where certainly where again Northerners were sympathetic to the plight of slaves in the South and got a feel for what their true experiences were like. Blake is another novel that was written during the 1850s, written by Martin Delany. Again, this novel centers around a slave named Blake who actually murders his slave owner and then escapes into the North. Again, certainly Southerners were outraged by both Uncle Tom's Cabin and Blake, and they also too offered their own accounts of slave life, where typically these were trying to paint slavery and the life of slaves in a positive picture. The Kansas-Nebraska Act as well too. Now this is going to be important as well. All right, because again this is really going to show the passion that again pro-slavery, anti-slavery advocates had for the issue. All right, the Kansas-Nebraska Act is at the center of it is Stephen Douglas. All right, remember Stephen Douglas from the Compromise of 1850, where basically he was a senator from Illinois who helped Henry Clay to kind of get each piece of that legislation passed through the Senate. Okay, so and again, we're going to get to see Stephen Douglas a little bit more in the coming sections because Abraham Lincoln, all right, is going to take on Stephen Douglas when it comes to his bid for re-election in Illinois for the Senate seat. So he's going to run against Stephen Douglas for Senate in Illinois, and they engage in a series of very famous debates called the Lincoln-Douglas debates. But we'll get to that shortly. All right, but again, getting back to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Compromise of 1850, all right, brought into play this method of popular sovereignty. All right, popular sovereignty was a method by which citizens of a territory, when they were becoming states and when they became states, would basically choose for themselves the role that slavery was going to play in their state. Whether they were going to vote and basically said, "Hey, we want to be a slave state," or "We want to be a free state." So in 1854, Nebraska Territory, all right. Again, is starting to organize. All right, Douglas proposes a bill that established a government in the Nebraska Territory, and popular sovereignty would be used to decide the issue of slavery in the territory when the state applied for statehood. So we know that again, you get a certain number of people, in a territory, and then basically those folks would write a constitution, apply for statehood. All right, and then after that, the state would vote on whether or not they wanted to be a slave state or a free state. All right, and again, this was called the method. This method would be called the method of popular sovereignty. The Kansas-Nebraska Act continued, and again, the next couple of slides, fellas, are going to be really geared towards the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The South feared that Nebraska would enter as a free state, so Douglas amended the bill to basically divide the territory into two. All right, so the northern part of the territory would be Nebraska. The southern part of the territory would be called Kansas. All right. The idea was that basically Nebraska, the northern part, would come in as a slave state. The southern part, Kansas, would come in as a slave state. However, this is not written into the bill. All right. Douglas does not write this into the bill. It's basically inferred. It's basically, thought that this was going to be the way that popular sovereignty would break down the territory into a slave and a non-slave, in slave and non-slave states. Um, and again, we're going to see kind of where this lack of detail here is going to lead to kind of a tumultuous situation in Kansas. The Kansas-Nebraska Act essentially nullifies the Missouri Compromise. And again, we remember the Missouri Compromise from earlier, all right? And again, where we brought Missouri in as a slave state, Maine in as a free state, but also, too, this idea that there was not going to be slavery north of the 3630 line of latitude. So basically, whether, if Kansas or Nebraska would have voted for slavery, all right, and when it came down to their, to popular sovereignty there, basically that would have nullified the Missouri Compromise because, again, both of those territories are above that 3630 line of latitude. After the act is passed and territories are organized, Kansas attracts settlers who wish to establish governments that were anti and pro slavery. So basically, those, again, the bill passes, all right, it establishes the territory of Kansas, it establishes the territory of Nebraska. And then basically, you start to have people flooding into Kansas who were both pro slavery and anti slavery advocates. They both set up governments, okay, and this is going to be where these two sides oppose one another. The pro-slavery government is based in a town called Lecompton, all right? And near Lecompton, all right, anti-slavery forces, they set up a town called Lawrence. The true government for the anti-slavery faction is based in Topeka, though, and Topeka will eventually become the capital city of Kansas. Both governments authored constitutions, and then both governments petitioned for statehood to Congress. So basically, this sets the stage for an outbreak of violence in Kansas. And basically, violence breaks out between pro and anti-slavery factions in 1856. All right, so it first starts when a group known as the Border Ruffians, all right, and the Border Ruffians were a pro-slavery group from Missouri. They raid the anti-slavery town of Lawrence, Kansas, which is very near to Lecompton, which was the capital of the anti-slavery faction. Basically, they burn parts of Lawrence to the ground. All right. So in retaliation, John Brown. All right, and that's John Brown. It's a picture of John Brown there on the right. And we're going to see John Brown again as we get closer to the Civil War. He is a radical. He is a religious fanatic, and he eventually will storm the arsenal at Harper's Ferry to basically, again, the arsenal is where basically the army held all of their weapons, and he's going to try to storm that arsenal. He's going to try to take those weapons, and his idea was that he was going to arm slaves in Virginia and start this huge slave uprising. But before he does that, and that's really what he's most famous for, is that Harper's Ferry raid. He is a pro-slavery settler in Kansas, and in reaction to the Border Ruffians and their actions in Lawrence, Kansas, John Brown and his supporters, and again, John Brown had a number of sons, and his sons were included in these supporters. They're going to murder 5 pro-slavery settlers at a place called Pottawatomie Creek. And basically, John Brown, and his followers, they take these guys, pretty much out of their shelters in the middle of the night, and they murder them, kind of right there. All right, and Pottawatomie Creek was very close to Lawrence, where the Border Ruffians had, again, enacted their violence prior. So basically, over the next several years, all right, you're going to have these outbreaks of violence, and basically Kansas is going to earn the name Bleeding Kansas. 1858, all right, our 14th president of the United States, all right, Franklin Pierce, he's going to encourage Congress to admit Kansas as a slave state, but Congress is going to refuse to do this. And eventually Kansas is admitted, all right, but they are admitted as a free state in 1861. That is the seal of the state of Kansas. And they are admitted after the Civil War begins. And then lastly, what we want to talk about is the Sumner Brooks incident, all right? And basically this is violence on the floor of the Senate, all right? And really what it came down to was Charles Sumner was a senator from Massachusetts. He was very much in the anti-slavery camp. He delivers a speech in reaction to what's going on in Bleeding, Kansas, that is very critical of the South and their encouragement of violence and the border ruffians in Kansas. All right. Really, during the speech, all right, he insults another senator, Andrew Butler from South Carolina, a Southerner, a pro-slavery Southerner. And again, the thing is, though, that Butler is not present at this meeting. All right, he is absent. So, in response, at a later time, Preston Brooks, who is Andrew Butler's nephew, who's also a member of the House of Representatives, literally assaults Sumner with a cane on the floor of the Senate. All right, he basically beats him unconscious. He's again, it's assault. He assaults him to the point where, and injures him to the point where Sumner can't to the Senate for 3 years. All right, he's in that bad a shape. In response to Preston Brooks' actions, Congress removed him from his seat. But in a show of support from his voters in South Carolina, they actually reelect him and send him back to the House of Representatives. All right. So again, really kind of shows that kind of shows his district and the South's support for his actions on the Senate floor. As we said, Sumner was unable to return to his post in the Senate due to his injuries for 3 years. But also in the same vein, he is reelected by his constituents, the people of Massachusetts, to another term in the Senate, even though he can't serve. And the idea being that his empty seat would kind of serve as a protest, all right, to not only Brooks's actions, but to the pro-slavery cause. And really, this is a shocking incident because the Senate is a place where open debate can occur, all right, and is encouraged, and certainly, again, an environment of nonviolence fosters that free debate between between senators based on all issues. So the fact that again, there's such passionate support for these two sides of the slavery debate, and that it can violence can occur on the Senate floor. Really kind of shows that again, kind of the division in the country during this time, and and again the division that is caused by slavery. So, fellas, that is 10-2. If you guys have questions, feel free to reach out, and then also to make sure you complete the work that accompanies the PowerPoint.